Good afternoon, and welcome to our panel discussion titled Darwinian Evolution: Are We Beyond the Conflict Between Science and Faith? This is a deceptively simple question. On one hand, the talks of this conference have showcased contemporary scholarship from different disciplines that certainly goes beyond this basic question. On the other hand, as talks on Sunday night by Francisco Ayala and Ken Miller highlighted, this conference in 2009 occurs in a larger cultural context where conflict between representatives of science and faith continue to rage on and garner media attention that only fuels the conflict. We are gathered here this afternoon to listen to the reflections of these distinguished panelists and join in conversation with them. Our time here will go in three distinct phases. First, each panelist will have approximately 5 minutes to give their reflections. Then the panelists will engage with one another in conversation, and finally we will take questions from the floor. There are some rules that we need to agree to for this time for questions. One is that questions should be addressed into the microphones in either aisle. The questions should indeed be questions and not commentary. If you must preface your question with commentary, it should be extremely brief. The question should be on topic, and you should make it clear whether you're directing your question to an individual panelist or to the panel as a whole. And with that, I give you Francisco Ayala.
I don't think we want to use the time with applause because we have 9 speakers, 5 minutes each. Don't you agree that we leave the applause all for them? So we'll save 30 seconds each time. Anyway, I will let the other participants to answer the question in whatever way they see fit. I have my own answer. I could say very generally, in some respects, yes. In some very important respects, yes. In many other important respects, not at all, certainly in terms of the general public. But I will going to tell you about an important respect in which a positive change has occurred involving a very distinguished group of people, namely members of the National Academy of Science, which probably you would not be aware, most likely, except perhaps for very few here, Michael Lynch and others, you would not be aware at all of the circumstances. On January 4th, 2008, this booklet was published, was presented in a press conference where the president of the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, and myself, as chairman of the committee that had redacted the document, was presented to the press in Washington. Now, as you see, this is addressed to opinion leaders and influentials, and you can see a list of people, policymakers, business leaders, scientists, religious leaders, medical professionals, etc., teachers and educators, very importantly. This is the third edition of a document where the second edition was published in 1999 and the first edition in 1984. The origin of the document is as follows. In 1981, the state of Arkansas had passed a law which was called the Balanced Treatment Law. It was introduced in the assembly, and 15 minutes before the end of the session for the year was rapidly approved without discussion. The statute, as it was called, of the law said that whenever evolution was being taught, creation science had to be taught and given equal time, actually. Obviously, the purpose was that biology teachers would not teach evolution because nobody had heard of something called creation science before, And it was identified in the statute by 6 statements, more or less taken out of the Genesis. I was at the time president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. I was also chairman of the Board on Biology of the National Research Council, and I happened to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences. We had a new president for the National Academy of Science, Frank Press, who was a geophysicist from Caltech. He had been science advisor to President Carter. So I went to see him, and we already had started, got in motion the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, for those who are not from the US, and a number of other entities who were going to challenge these laws unconstitutional. I went to see the president of the National Academy of Sciences, who agreed that the National Academy of Sciences should perhaps take a position in this matter because it seemed very important. So, but we don't know what. So a committee was appointed that consisted of 5 or 6 big-time constitutional lawyers, some university professors, some of the very, very large law companies, law firms, and then 4 or 5 scientists. And the idea was that the lawyers would tell us in what way we could help the case, because obviously the case was going to be taken to the courts, and the ACLU lawyers and others were already working on that. Well, what the lawyers told us was very simple. Just prepare a document, 30 or 40 pages, which says what is the status of evolution as science and what is the position of the academy on this matter. And then when the court case comes, all what we will do is to add some words, preamble, and some words at the end, legalese. But what is going to count is not our words, the lawyer's words, but the document of the academy. So the first edition of this document was prepared with no intention at the time of being made public. As it happens, I was the only evolutionist in the committee, so I wrote 95% of it. It was easy for me, having written about these subjects considerably and several textbooks. So then one physicist added something about astrophysics, and a geologist another half page about geology. Then the case was assigned in federal court in Little Rock, in the District Court of Little Rock, and the judge was John Overton. The lawyers immediately researched this lawyer, and they took their hands to their head. This guy has only experience in insurance law. He's a lawyer who comes from insurance law and has been appointed a judge. They had no confidence whatsoever that this judge was going to do any proper labor, so they decided that they were not going to present the document at the level of the district court, but we will present it on appeal. Well, to end this part of the story very briefly, the judge wrote a fantastic decision, so good as a statement of the scientific method and otherwise. The decision was published complete, 10,000 words in Science, in the magazine called Science. The state of Arkansas decided not to appeal. In the meantime, the state of Louisiana had passed a similar law. There were 11 other states that were considering similar laws, but all dropped them. But Louisiana had already passed the law. The judge there said, I am not going to have a trial because it's the same law, word by word, and already has been decided. The state of Louisiana appealed to the Supreme Court, and the document eventually saw the light, presented to the Supreme Court. Somehow I have lost the track. I will take only a couple of minutes. Remember, Paul has told me I could take 2 of his minutes.
The cap and trade, yes, I know.
So in the meantime, because it was not going to be used in the courts, it was published. Then in the 1990s, 1996, as the intelligent design movement was coming in, the Council of the Academy, now a different president, Bruce Alves, a biologist, the Council of the Academy had decided to have a new edition. They asked me again to chair the committee, and we prepared a second edition. Then in 2006, when the intelligent design movement was getting more and more aggressive, they got a call this time by the new president of the Academy of Sciences, Ralph Ciceron, who was an atmospheric chemist, had been the chancellor at my university, and I knew very well. And he called me, he says, the council wants you to chair the committee again. And said, well, 82, 94, 2006, that's when the committees were appointed. I told him, so long as I am asked only every 12 years, I'm willing to do it 5 or 6 more times. But anyway, it was intended as a joke. I hope nobody laughed. Anyway, the main point that I want to make, I will make now briefly. In the second edition, at the meeting of the Academy, Bruce Alves, the president, told, this document is being prepared again. I want Francisco to tell you something about what we're trying to do. And one thing that we were considering to do, and that's what Bruce Alves wanted me to test with members of the Academy, was to, for the first time, start to bring in statements from religious communities who support evolution. All hell broke loose. Several members got up objecting tremendously. What in the world is the National Academy of Sciences, this most prestigious scientific body in the world, saying anything about religion one way or another? Tremendous opposition. Yeah, I'll finish by telling you that when we came to this document is filled of quotations from the Pope, the clergy letter, the Methodist Federation of Bishops, other Christian churches, Jewish communities, and Islam communities. By now, the members of the Academy have come to realize that this dialogue between science and religion had to go on and was a positive thing to do. I must say I would never have predicted that 12 years earlier. I'll stop here.
You're not allowed to clap. I'm going to offer only a couple of brief comments. I just want to introduce the theme, really. At an intellectual level, as I think we heard this morning, there are numerous ways in which we could, without any enormous intellectual struggle, move beyond the conflict between science and faith. But unfortunately, there are very strong sociological reasons for maintaining that conflict on both sides. I think it's important to note that Darwinism, as well as a scientific theory, can be constructed as a philosophy of nature. And that's not actually an intellectually illegitimate activity. I mean, my model actually here would be the philosopher Michael Ruse. And Michael has become increasingly clear over the years that he holds 2 views about Darwinism. One, that there is a indisputable scientific account of descent with modification of the kind that some of us have been discussing here. The other is that he subscribes to a frankly ideological Darwinism. In Michael's book, Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? I was slightly bowled over when that book came out. The reason at the end of the book that he concludes that a Darwinian can't be a Christian is that the moral vision that he derives from sociobiology is inconsistent with the moral vision of Christianity. Now, I don't take that to be a scientific statement. I think this activity of constructing a Darwinian philosophy of nature is an entirely extra scientific activity. But it's a purely philosophical activity. But it's not an illegitimate purely philosophical activity. It is an attempt to construct a certain philosophical worldview. And one of the problems is that it's almost irresistible. I think, in fact, Michael Ruse does an exemplary job of not yielding to this temptation. But for most people who are tempted by Darwinism as a nature philosophy, a philosophy of nature, it's almost irresistible not to try and lend that philosophical worldview some of the authority and the imprimatur of science. And I think that's a temptation that people will continue to yield to, and I won't name any particular names. And on the other side, I would draw attention to, as I took it to be, the argument of Ron Number's excellent and scholarly history of the American creationist movement, the creationists, in which Numbers argues, he treats the evolution of creationism, as many of you will know, as simply an example of intellectual history. We might ask, how has creationism changed in the same way that the pre-formation theory perhaps changed over 150 years of intellectual history? And at least in the 20th century, the history of creationism could be characterized as a race to the bottom, that the crudest, most conflict-ridden version has the highest market value. It attracts the most attention, and it gets you the most votes, as it were. So on both sides, we have strong sociological pressures, which unfortunately mean that despite people in this room might have very good intellectual resolutions to that conflict, it will be deliberately regenerated and stay with us for a long time.
Descriptively, the answer to this question is clearly no. We are not beyond the conflict between the science of evolution and Christian faith. Grant Ramsey and I came across a vivid example of that a few weeks ago when we took some undergraduate students to the Creation Museum in northern Kentucky, which is impressive in its own way positing of an insurmountable conflict between the science of evolution and faith. While it would be false to reduce the diversity of evangelical Protestantism to fundamentalism and fundamentalism to young earth creationism, it is clear that a great number of Christians in the United States perceive a conflict, whether they choose to opt for the sort of radical disjunction that Grant and I saw in northern Kentucky, or simply choose, as I suspect many do, not to think about it unless they're forced to think about it when they take a class in evolution. Now, a relatively small number of people of faith are academic theologians. There, too, one has to say that we are not beyond the conflict, but that is a thoroughly good thing. Like any intellectual discipline, creativity in theology arises from posing difficult questions accurately and solving them creatively. Actually, as an intellectual endeavor, theology was born when a relatively small sect from the Eastern Mediterranean became the dominant religion of the Greco-Roman world, which led to many, many, many conflicts between the Greek worldview and the view of world, time, human beings, and the divine that came out of biblical texts. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Tertullian famously asked, and generations of creative theologians answered. Now, it might be worth pointing out that it took about 4 or 5 centuries, which is a sobering thought. We might need to take the long view on this. Now, I agree with both Bill Carroll and Celia Dean Drummond that evolution does theology, academic theology, a favor by compelling it to return to its sources. Theology is a historically reflexive discipline, and whenever it takes it for granted that it has mastered its sources in Scripture and tradition, then stagnation follows rather quickly. I suspect that it is a sense of such a stagnant theology that has led some theologians to claim that evolution has changed things so dramatically that we need to chuck out everything associated with what is sometimes disparagingly called classical theism, or that Scripture needs to be replaced by the universe story of Barry and Swim. And I agree with them that they're wrong on this. It certainly challenges certain theological positions, images, and metaphors. Paley's Watchmaker is probably most famous among them. But it's never bad to go back to the drawing board. We discover a richer and less manageable God in so doing, but one that I think is more true to the God revealed in the Bible. Let me just take one issue, and that is the issue of contingency in relation to divine purposes. It would be hard to imagine a set of histories more rife with contingencies than the ones that are rendered in the Hebrew Bible, and yet this is not an obstacle there to a conviction that God is at work. Indeed, in his wonderful book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, Robert Alter points out that the genius of the biblical authors lies precisely in their deployment of various narrative techniques to gesture toward a meaning to history that is not discerned at the expense of denying contingency or sidelining it, but by deploying it. He writes, quote, "The ancient Hebrew writers seek through the process of narrative realization to reveal the enactment of God's purposes in historical events. However, they do so in a way that is continually complicated by the perception of two approximately parallel dialectical tensions. One is the tension between the divine plan and the disorderly character of actual historical events, and the other is a tension between God's will and human freedom." So I think actually evolution does us a favor as academic theologians to go back and reread biblical narratives, to recover powerful distinctions such as the one that Bill talked about. So I'm grateful for the conflict, and I hope it doesn't go away anytime soon, because for one thing, it means I'll still have a job. Now, I was thinking, and Francis was talking, one of my teachers at the University of Chicago was Langdon Gilkey, who was one of the witnesses at the 1981 trial. And when I took science and religion from him, he exhorted us on a number of occasions never to forget that what we talked about and the way that we thought about religion had not a lot to do with what was going on outside the walls of the University of Chicago Divinity School. And Paul has already talked a little bit about that broader conflict. And there, well, not obviously, but the conflict there is not a welcome one. How should we think about it? I think part of the issue was already raised by Peter Bowler. Darwinism emerged at a time precisely when other fragmenting processes that afflict the modern world were becoming prominent. Just 4 months after Origin of Species, essays and reviews came out by a group of broad church Anglicans arguing for the cogency of so-called higher biblical criticism and connecting it with Darwinism in a connection that became irresistible, particularly in the United States. This situation has not been improved today by the so-called new atheists. I think dealing creatively with these problems require us to range broadly into intra-ecclesial issues about the nature and methods of catechesis and homiletics, how we present the Bible, but also the popular reception of Darwinism. That is, to borrow from the medieval trivium, we need to use not just grammar and logic or dialectics, but rhetoric, the art of persuasion. But thankfully, I've run out of time before I can broach these difficult issues. But I hope we can continue to discuss those with the others.
Thank you. Just working well. Thank you. I'm going to be extremely brief for 2 reasons. The first is that a few of you may be listening to me yet again later on. The second is that, in fact, I've sold most of my time to some of the other panelists, but I'm not at liberty to tell you which ones they are. You might guess. Very briefly, my observations are not going to be particularly constructive or helpful, and they'll also be extremely English. The first is that the conflict is very much with us, and perhaps for our professional careers, fortunately it shows no signs of going away. It's sometimes worth reminding people in North America and Europe that there are other parts of the world where these topics are becoming matters of particular interest, and they may be arriving at conclusions which are not in our interest, so you might wish to remember that in the next 50 years. You didn't hear it first here, but you've heard it yet again. The other thing which strikes me quite forcibly is, with great respect to the first approximation, you can read these antagonistic discussions going back to the time of Darwin, and almost nothing new has been said, very largely on both sides. That in itself I find extremely interesting. I think that effectively if we're going to make any sort of progress in this area, then in principle what one's got to do is avoid the current mudslinging and the entrenched positions, and not for a moment what I imagine as a single person even on this campus who would subscribe to any such view, but just beyond there, let us say in Illinois, for example. Then there is the necessity, I think, to try and find some new sorts of dialogue. And I'm very forcibly struck, for example, by the wonderful work of Mary Midgley, who I know very, very slightly. She's a particularly interesting woman because not only is she, in my opinion, an excellent philosopher, I'm not one at all, but also she's, I think it's fair to say, broadly agnostic. And that's sometimes a useful reminder for some of the combatants which are nearer to this particular exchange of missiles. Another thing which is going to be extremely offensive, but strikes me quite forcibly, is that there are particular dangers in trying to import other people's methodologies on the assumption that they're somehow dealing with their up-to-date science or theology. I'm quite struck by the fact that, at least in my own area, ideas which are now being adopted by the humanities are largely out of date in terms of sciences for approximately the last 20 years. There's nothing we can do about this. It takes a long time for data and intellectual property to percolate through the body politic, but nevertheless it does mean that it's extraordinarily difficult to keep up to date with other areas. And this, I think, has a most unfortunate consequence, and there's nothing much I can suggest that we can do about it. But the fact of the matter is that I think it is perhaps more true of some areas of science trying to talk to religion, that the areas of dialogue are astonishingly thin. And as I say, this is a criticism, which is not really a very fair thing to say in a public arena like this. But I think unless we begin to rethink really quite substantially what the claims of science originally were and what the claims of any religion are, then in views of dialogue, then it will be mostly, I'm afraid, going to remain in terms almost entirely of conflict. That may not be a bad thing. I should remind you that we are an extremely aggressive and intelligent species. Thank you.
I always like talking at these conferences because I get to write something out and read it, which I don't get to do in my own field. As a scientist, I always have to have PowerPoints. So this frees me and lets me pretend I'm a different kind of person. But when thinking about this question, I, of course, would hope that we had come a long way in 150 years with respect to the conflict between faith and science. And what I've seen is I'm going to actually talk more about the cultural context in which this controversy exists. And I think we've become more polarized, and if not more polarized, then certainly much more confused over the issue, especially here in the United States. And now that's not to say, and everybody has pointed out, that there actually has been quite a bit of intellectual progress over the last 150 years, as evidenced by the talks that we were able to enjoy in this particular conference. But just that type of dialogue that's happening here in this room is not what the public is exposed to on a daily basis. And it's the public discourse that is much more influential with respect to shaping attitudes about science and faith here in the United States than what we do behind these closed doors. And this is what I think has to change. So I am a scientist, so let me give you a little data. So there was an article published in Science in 2006 by John Miller, Eugenie Scott, and Shinji Okamoto on public acceptance of evolution, which revealed some very interesting trends in this respect. So comparing public opinion polls taken in 1985 with those taken in 2005, the number of U.S. adults accepting evolution dropped from 45% to 45 to 40%, despite what the National Academy of Science has been publishing. So they're putting out their publications, but it doesn't seem to be having an impact on public opinion in terms of evolution. Interestingly, the number of U.S. adults overtly rejecting evolution also dropped, even more so, going from 48% to 39%. And the greatest change was in the individuals who were unsure about evolution, which increased from 7% to 21% of the population. So it appears that after 20 years of public debate, the U.S. is still evenly split between acceptance and rejection of evolution, with both sides losing almost equal numbers, and an increasing number of individuals no longer sure where they stand on the issue. And I think this is bad news. So to put these results in a more global context, 33 other developed countries were also surveyed throughout Europe and Japan, and the U.S. ranked number 33 out of 34, with only Turkey having fewer number of adults accepting evolution. So approximately 1 out of 3 adults in the U.S. claims evolution is false, whereas this number in Europe ranged from 7 to 15%. So although you think the problem is in Europe, it's very acute here in the United States.
I was thinking of further afield.
So why is there this discrepancy between the U.S. and most other industrialized nations? Well, one clear factor that we've already talked about in this conference, of course, is the structure of religious beliefs in the U.S. versus other industrialized nations, and especially American fundamentalism, with its emphasis on a biblical literalism, which contrasts with Catholicism and other mainstream Protestantism common in Europe. But not surprisingly so, in this paper they showed that the U.S. there's a very strong link between conservative religious beliefs and the rejection of evolution. But a second, more important factor is how evolution has been politicized in the U.S. The adoption of creationism as part of a political platform of the conservative wing of the Republican Party has no real parallels in Europe and Japan. And additionally, anti-evolutionism is coupled with other more personal beliefs, such as anti-abortionism, anti-homosexuality, etc., causing them to be bundled together politically here in the U.S., whereas in Europe and Japan, being pro-life or accepting evolution are more easily separable, and individual views on these issues do not necessarily fall along major political lines. And a third factor is genetic literacy. There's a positive correlation between a greater understanding of genetics and the acceptance of evolution across all countries. Interestingly, however, the mean score of genetic literacy is higher in the US as compared to Europe, indicating that overall Americans understood genetics slightly better than their European counterparts. However, Americans were particularly confused in their understanding of the genetic relationship of humans to other organisms, and did not acknowledge that humans share over half their genes with mice and chimpanzees, reflecting a general tendency to consider humans as genetically exceptional, which in this case means that faith seems to be trumping science. So where they want to apply genetics and science, they do, but where they don't, they just strongly don't. So these trends in the US public are reflected in the students I teach as well. So we talk about intellectual theology, we talk about what's happening in the universities, but it's actually impacting us as well. So for the past 15 years, I've taught evolution to hundreds of students, and over that time, I have seen a steady increase in the number of students troubled by what they see as an epic battle between evolution and religion being played out in the public arena. I find this particularly surprising here at Notre Dame, given that the Vatican's general tolerance of biological evolution, and that Notre Dame students tend to be some of the best equipped individuals in the country to handle the nuances of the evolution-religion debate. However, the constant exposure to the politicization of evolution, the extensive media coverage of creationism movement's attempts to block teaching of evolution, the infiltration of the science-religion debate into popular culture, such as The Simpsons. I mean, you can Google, you'll get movies on YouTube about the evolution and religion debate, has permeated the way students view the issues over and above whatever kinds of theological teachings they're getting outside of the public media. Also influential, of course, people have mentioned the growing number of popular science writers, such as Richard Dawkins, who have criticized religious views on scientific grounds, but in a sensationalist and combative manner. The net result is more misinformation and hyperbole on both sides that's making it increasingly difficult for the American public and even our incoming students to navigate the underlying issues confidently. Clearly, the argument is coming through loud and clear, but not so much the answers. Now, Notre Dame students are going to be fine. They do gain the resources needed to devise their own solutions to these questions while here. And I only brought them up because I'm just saying if anybody's going to be more have immunity to it, Notre Dame students would probably be those kinds of students. So if they're actually being influenced by these issues, you can imagine what the general public is going through. But what about the rest of the US? The science article, of course, advocates better science education to increase genetic literacy as one of the solutions to the dilemma. And I don't disagree that this would be a good thing for many reasons beyond the debate. And I think scientists take this task very seriously and have worked hard to increase scientific literacy generally. However, I honestly don't think that this is going to be enough. What we need is to hear a greater plurality of voices on these issues coming from theology and philosophy. So here's my little plea. That make it into the mainstream public and political discourse. It's one thing to have these solutions be discussed at a conference, but it's another thing to have them now go out there and be part of that conversation, rather than just saying, okay, there's that conversation out there, maybe it'll go on for another 100 years or so, but I think we need to take a more active role. And these are voices that represent a more nuanced and balanced or intelligent take, or more scholarly take on the issues in order to reclaim the middle ground that's been lost to the polarized views that have received a disproportionate amount of attention over the past 20 years. Just as there is now a push to train scientists to become better communicators with the general public in Washington, D.C., there are actually programs and people are embedding themselves into offices of senators just to be science advisors on the ground. We need representatives of these other fields to interact more proactively and play a much larger role in the public discourse on science and faith if we're going to be able to change these public opinions in any constructive manner.
Human evolution is the sort of the front line of this this particular conflict, because even if you're uncomfortable with evolution, or rather, if you're uncomfortable with evolution, you are especially uncomfortable with the notion of us having a record, a fossil record, which suggests things were very different from the way that they're portrayed in the Bible. I think one of the problems with evolution is that it's one of the few places where the public actually come into contact with science. This might be changing because of the interest in climate change, but by and large, people manage to run their lives without being in contact with science. You can own a car and you cannot, you're not interested in the science of automobiles. You just want the car to work. You can own a washing machine or you can own a cell phone. You're not interested in the science behind that. You just want the thing to work. Whereas in evolution, I think it's one of the few places where people are faced with science. And of course, the one thing about science is that if you're a scientist, you have to confess that you don't know everything. Well, that is interpreted as incompetence, because you should know everything. And it's very difficult to explain to people that that's not how science works. Something that paleoanthropology could do is we should be a lot more modest in what we claim, because that the claims about finding something which is the ancestor of all other hominins, then inevitably other scientists have to say, well, that might not be the only explanation for these fossils. And then everybody says, well, you guys are just a lot of incompetence. I mean, you can't make up your minds. And I'm not sure how to tackle that, because that's not just in human evolution, that's in almost everything else in science. And I don't know how to tackle that. As far as human evolution is concerned, it's very difficult for me to say anything that is comforting to somebody who doesn't want to hear that there is a fossil record, and that fossil record maybe goes back several millions of years. But there's not much else I can do than explain, that's how I see it. Then they say, you guys can't make up how many, you can't make your minds up how many species there are. So, why should we listen to this? Well, I think, you need to go and explain that I suspect that if you go out into the street there, you can identify a Chevrolet, and you can tell the difference between a Chevrolet and a Toyota. But if I took the front brake, the front near side brake from the Toyota, and a little bit of the rear seat, and the speedometer, and I put it in a pile on the road, and I took some other parts out of the Chevrolet and said, are you able to tell the difference between the Chevrolet and the Toyota? They would say, no, I'm not. Well, that's the puzzle that we're faced with. We don't see these organisms as a whole. We only see small parts of them. So our options are either to say, look, we're not going to try and interpret these fossils. We're just going to leave them in a little pile. And because when we do try and interpret them, we come up with different ideas, and these different ideas only gives succor to the people who don't agree with evolution. So I'm not willing to do that, and I think none of us. And there were some discussions a few years ago, that we should try and come up with with an agreed view about human evolution. It's a bit like asking a cell biologist, to come up with an agreed view about, whatever they're interested in. I mean, that's just anti-science. That's not the way science works. Science works by having these views aired, and the weaknesses and the strengths of the views weighed. So it is tough, because it's really, the conflict is between how science works, and probably the only way science can work, and the fact that a lot of folk would like to know things for certain, and there is very little that we know for certain.
Thank you. I'll stand off to the side since I have a few PowerPoint slides. And I apologize, I didn't realize that you wouldn't be able to see the bottom third of the screen very well. But I'll try to fill you in if there's some important stuff down there. So here's the question: are we beyond the conflict between science and faith? And in thinking about how to answer this question, I thought, well, I could give a two-hour answer, which would have some depth and thoroughness and perhaps sophistication. Or I could give a two-word answer. And given that I only have a few hundred seconds to speak, I decided on the two-word answer. And that is, it depends. And so what I thought I'd do with the rest of my time is to say a little bit about what it depends on. I could stop here, and perhaps I should, but what I'll do is explicate and talk a little bit about the question. Philosophers, I'm a philosopher, philosophers are almost as good as politicians at avoiding answering questions. Politicians generally do it by talking instead about something that they want to talk about that's somehow related to the question on hand. Philosophers often do it by just talking about the question. So that's what I'm going to do. One problem with this question is that it's operating, I think, at too broad a level of generality. It's a little bit like asking whether Notre Dame or Duke is better at sports. That question is really unanswerable unless we get down to the specifics. What sports exactly are we talking about? If we're talking about football, there's a football down there if you can't see it, then we might have a pretty clear answer. We have some sense of what it is to be a better team, although even then we might say, well, do you mean better defense? Do you mean better offense? There are subtleties beyond that. And with Duke, if we're talking about basketball, it seems to be there's a pretty clear answer. So this question is are we beyond the conflict between science and faith, is a little bit like this, but actually I think it's a lot worse. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read, another thing that philosophers do, they read in slow motion, which can be really annoying, but if you're not used to it. So that's what I'm going to do. So are we beyond the conflict between science and faith? So what is the we? That's one thing we need to be clear on. That's something that I'm not actually going to talk about, but that's something to think about. What do we mean by conflict? What do we mean by science? And what do we mean by faith? So given that each of these can mean a variety of things, there's actually perhaps an uncountable infinitude of possible questions that we might be asking when we're asking this question. So faith in what exactly? I'm pretty naive theologically. I'm just a simple country philosopher. But when I hear someone talking about faith, I want to say, well, faith in what exactly? And you might have faith that there is some God or another. You might have faith that, say, the earth is fewer than or approximately 6,000 years old. You might have faith that humans have an eternal soul. And what about science? What is science? This is not an easy question to answer. In this context, we're talking about evolution, and the panelists, like Dr. Holliker's discussion of some of these polls talking about whether people believe in evolution, they haven't really interrogated the question of what we mean by evolution. And evolution can mean a lot of things. It can mean just change over time. That's something that people prior to Darwin thought. That wasn't something that Darwin originated. It can mean a certain branching structure, like we heard about earlier today and throughout this conference. Or we might be talking about a particular mechanism of change. And Darwin was not perhaps the originator of natural selection, but he was original in thinking that natural selection was a creative force, and that's a particular kind of mechanism. And he was arguing for this branching structure. So when we're talking about evolution, whether we believe in evolution, we might believe in someone might believe in the change over time, but not in the branching structure, or believe in a particular mechanism that's non-Darwinian, but also believe in the branching structure and so forth. So these are logically, to some degree, logically independent. As Professor Ashley mentioned, we recently took a rather disturbing trip to the Creation Museum. I thought it would be I'd walk through it snickering, but it was actually sort of cognitively quite disturbing. And one of the interesting things, though, is that if you look at what claims they have, they actually buy natural selection, and they buy evolution. Although they don't call it evolution, they call it diversification. So they buy the branching tree, the structure, and change over time. But they just think that there were kinds that were created, the dogs or cats or monkeys. They might actually quibble with monkeys since they They think the kinds are roughly correlate with the family level descriptions. But anyway, they call this the orchard of life view instead of the tree of life. So there are actually multiple trees of life. This is from today's New York Times. I don't know if anybody read that. You've been pretty busy today. But this is an article from the Science Times today. Creationism minus a young Earth emerges in the Islamic world. It's a very interesting article, and one of the things that it reports on is some recent surveys. Here's one survey of 2,500 Pakistani high school students. 25% of the students agreed with the creationist sentiment, quote, evolution is not a well-accepted scientific fact. But listen to this, 86% agreed with the statement, millions of fossils show that life has existed for billions of years and has changed over time. So let me read the last of that again. Life has existed for billions of years and has changed over time. So somebody might say that statement and think that they're actually talking about evolution. But so I think it's really important, especially in these studies, to think about what are people referring to when they say evolution? Because it seems to be that we might think that they're meaning something, but they're actually meaning something quite different. So on to conflict. What is conflict? Well, there are at least three major types of conflict that I thought of. One is logical conflict, another is personal conflict, and the third is social conflict. By logical conflict, I mean some kind of logical contradiction. So there is a God of some form or another. Does that logically contradict some contemporary science or some branch of contemporary science? It seems that it doesn't, at least stated like that. The Earth is fewer than 6,000 years old. That seems to contradict contemporary geology and biology. Humans have an eternal soul. That's what it says on the bottom in case you can't see that. Does that contradict contemporary science? Well, again, that depends. It depends what we mean by a soul. Is a soul, does it have some sort of causal relationship with our morality, our ethics, and so forth, or is it just sort of causally independent of what's happening? If the latter, then there's no conflict. If the former, there's at least space for conflict. And finally, personal conflict. Does holding religious views hamper one's ability to do science? So one might hold views that are logically contradictory, but it might not have might in no way change the way in which one is doing one's science. If my anecdotal experience about Notre Dame students can be generalized, they do just fine holding a lot of contradictory views. Social conflict. Are we beyond social conflicts? As Professor Ashley said, as the Creation Museum shows quite clearly, the answer is no, and you probably can't see it, but this is a room in which they have these panels, and on one side they have human reason, and on the other side they have God's word. And the idea is that you should believe what's on the right and not the left. So it's interesting that they're attacking not evolutionary biology, not just science, but actually human reason. You'd think they'd be worried about appearing irrational, but they tend to bite every bullet that comes their way. So to sum it up, I think in order to answer a question like this, we need to be a little bit more concrete, and we need to think carefully about what we're talking about. So are we beyond the, say, logical, personal, social conflicts between natural selection or the tree of life or the old age of the earth and faith that there is a God and an eternal soul or a 6,000-year-old earth? Thank you.
Okay, I'm Celia Dean Drummond, and I'm sure that your concentration levels must be diminishing a little after hearing so many panelists. So I'm going to look at the question, Darwinian evolution. Are we beyond the conflict between science and faith? So in other words, I had a word before the more general word when I was thinking this out. And the first, I've got 7 points. The first point has to do with history and public education. I think part of the problem that that's being faced both here and in other parts of the world is an ignorance of history. So understanding the historical issues behind the so-called conflict between science and religion, both since Darwin and beyond Darwin, I think is crucial. Because at the time of Darwin, the representation of that history has been that the most ferocious antagonists were those of religious faith. But if you look back into the history, it's clear that there was scientific controversy at the time as well. In addition to that, many of those who were religious supported the idea. And I think of Henry Drummond, who might even be one of my ancestors, I haven't checked. He was a firm believer in theistic evolution. So that's the first one, that we need to tell students and the public more about the actual historical issues behind this, the supposed conflict between science and religion as represented in the Darwin debates. The first one is the second point is more of a philosophical one, and that's, I would say, that the ambiguity remains. That is, are we beyond implies a before and an after, and I don't think that came up in Grant's analysis of the sentence, but it's another it's another philosophical point within it. But by looking at the question, I think to suggest there's a before and after assumes that there is a transition from one to the other, but I think it's much more muddled than this. So in other words, while academic theologians might congratulate themselves on their ability to speak about God and evolution, public confusion remains. So you get a number of different layers of discourse, depending on whether it's the public academic theology, depending on whether it's students in one university. In other words, it's a contextual issue, and there's a huge variety and a lot of confusion. The third one has to do with what I would call the insufficiency of scientific explanation. What do I mean by this? By this I mean that if we recognise or realise that Darwinian evolution on its own is not sufficient as a descriptor of either human nature or the complex world in which we live, then the idea of conflict will not arise so readily. So we need to try and convince different or diverse audiences, especially those who don't know much about the field of science and religion, that scientific explanations can never be all inclusive. And this came, I shouldn't comment on other people's work, comments, so I'll just refrain from that. The third one, the fourth point, has to do with Darwin as symbolic science. Now, what do I mean by that? By that I mean that Darwinian evolution takes on symbolic meaning, a symbolic meaning that associates Darwin with a particular scientific view of the world, especially the views peddled by authors such as Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins comes to symbolize a kind of materialism and an anti-religious position that takes on symbolic meaning. So I believe that creationism will continue to flourish while there are ultra-Darwinians around, and vice versa. They feed off one another. They're mirror images of one another. Intelligent design tries to fill the gap in the scientific knowledge, but like the God of the gaps, that is also very unsatisfying. If you like, I don't think that there is much need to be too concerned about intelligent design because, in a sense, it's self-defeating. The fifth point has to do with the need for humility, and this applies to both those of religious belief or theologians or scientists. I think that unless there's a willingness to admit the validity of other positions, then there's always going to be conflict, and conflict of the type that's what I would call unnecessary rather than creative. So when we think about complex issues such as human nature and our own understanding of ourselves in relationship to other species and so on, there's always going to be the need for a diversity of views and a diversity of explanation. I also think that squeezing out the validity of theological traditions within the academy, that's also, interestingly enough, becoming increasingly popular in the UK as the various theology departments get replaced by religious studies and so on. That in itself is a mistake, because it's more likely to keep in place the polarized views between more extreme forms of religious fundamentalism and science. So I think theology has a place in the academy and a place that it needs to assert in relation to some of these kind of issues. The sixth point has to do with tensions prevailing. I don't think we can ever remove altogether the possibility of tensions existing between Darwinian evolutionary accounts of life and those proposed by faith. Easing this tension either by avoidance, saying they're speaking completely different languages, or synthesis, pretending that they're both saying the same thing, only provides very temporary relief. And this is because I believe that our systematic accounts of God, of Christ, of the Holy Spirit, of pneumatology, or the work of the church and so on, is situated in a cultural context. It needs to be if it's going to be meaningful in the 21st century. And one of the contexts in which that century is situated is a post-Darwinian one. Reducing the faith to that context or somehow separating from it means that theology is no longer able to speak into it. And then the seventh point, which is my last point, is about the responsibility of the theologian. I believe that the theologian has a responsibility to learn to live with those tensions, but also to use it creatively in order to make the ancient traditions that it has come alive in our societies in which we exist today. Okay, thank you.
Hello, John O'Callaghan. I'd like to thank Professor Ayala for suggesting you hold your applause until the end, because I will receive all the applause for all these excellent comments. I fear as a philosopher I'm going to be more assertive here than I like to be. I like to usually be a little bit more argumentative, but I am going to make some assertions. And I'm addressing the question as Darwinian science in the broader context of science, so not concentrating so much on the question of Darwin and evolution. Think of the universe as a symphony or a song, for both are made up of notes produced by strings vibrating in particular ways. Michael Green, the Lacassian Chair of Mathematics. Strenuous intellectual work in the study of God's nature are the angels that will lead me through all the troubles of this life with consolation, strength, and uncompromising rigor. Albert Einstein. And when love speaks, the voice of all the gods makes heaven drowsy with the harmony. William Shakespeare. When I was a physics major in college, my father happened to be a professor of medieval philosophy at the same institution. One day, after lecturing on Dante and explaining the music of the spheres to the students, he happened across my physics professor, Jim Lang. He asked him, "Jim, can you hear the music of the spheres?" Professor Lang responded, "Hear it? Hear it? Bill, I can't turn the damned stuff off." I want to suggest that that ought to be our attitude toward the appreciation of the ways in which the invisible things of God are made visible by the things of creation, which I think is the crux of the matter in addressing the question, are we beyond the conflict between science and faith? The grammar of the question suggests that it is a factual question, as if subject to a kind of sociological investigation. Is it or is it not the case that perhaps most, or even a simple majority, of a certain group of what? Intellectuals, citizens, common persons on the street, religious believers, scientists, are beyond the conflict between science and faith? But I trust that as a philosopher who is a believing and practicing Roman Catholic, I was not asked here to weigh in on that sociological question. My focus is and ought to be on the tacit normative claim hidden behind the grammar of the question. Ought we to be beyond that conflict? And the answer to that is, of course we ought to be. Let us suppose that science provides us with an insight into the workings of natural causality. Let us also suppose that faith provides us with an insight into the workings of divine causality. A favorite tactic of people of faith and scientists alike to eliminate any apparent conflict between faith and science tends towards an epistemological resolution of the supposed conflict. Science involves a knowing of facts and truth. Faith involves feeling and a kind of emotional response to the transcendent, where the transcendent is understood to be noumenal, beyond the realm of fact and truth. So first assertion, that solution is nonsense, as it misunderstands the nature of both Catholic faith and natural science. Even mediocre scientists, like I once aspired to be, not to mention great scientists, often experience a kind of awe and wonder at the intelligibility of what they study, an intelligible reality that does not depend upon, but rather transcends them. And Catholic Christians, who are perhaps the most mediocre of Christians, not to mention Christians generally, make claims of fact when they speak of God, claims they assert as true, which exclude their contradictory opposites as false. The divine transcends the natural. It does not transcend the factual and the true. No, this epistemological solution won't do. On the contrary, there can be no conflict between faith and science because of the factual truth claims about God that Christians ought to make animated by faith. God is not a natural cause and is thus not understood within the context of natural sciences that do study natural causes. In other words, the knowledge of God gleaned through philosophically informed faith ought not to be understood to be a kind of scientific hypothesis in competition with other scientific theories for explaining the mundane workings of the natural world, as if we are trying to decide between a divine caloric or transcendent phlogiston on the one hand and naturalistic thermodynamic kinetic theory or oxygen. This mistake would suggest that when naturalistic science fails, we appeal to the God hypothesis, as if to the God particle in cosmology. And when it succeeds, we exclude the God hypothesis, which exclusion for Orthodox Christians is presumably a denial of the doctrine of providence. On the contrary, Catholic Christians ought to recognize God in the success of science, not its failure. To see this, one must adhere to and try to understand the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, which Bill Carroll talked about at length this morning. That doctrine requires that we not think of God as a kind of natural cause, only a really, really powerful one, perhaps an omnipotent natural cause, a kind of Uber-Gott, like an Ubermensch, able because of his power to do what we cannot do, and yet doing it in pretty much the way we do it, interacting with a world presupposed to our action. It is true that as natural causes, we engage and interact with other natural causes. The more one natural cause does, the less another does. But if God truly creates from nothing the world and its causes, then it is nonsense to suggest that God interacts with natural causes as we do. It is a kind of anthropomorphism for religious believers to see God as needing to intervene in nature to achieve his purposes, undermining the autonomy of natural causes. It's as if fearing that creating and sustaining all things in being from nothing isn't enough for God to do. We need to find something else for God to do to keep him busy. But it is equally anthropomorphic for other religious believers trying to uphold the autonomy of nature to say that God created it all and then left it to work itself out. Both of these moves involve acting as if God is like a natural cause, only standing outside all of the rest of the natural causes. Natural causes operate on presupposed material or refrain from doing so. But there is nothing presupposed that God acts upon in creation. That's why creation ex nihilo, a doctrine that as a matter of history was a hard-won victory of Christian orthodoxy against ancient Gnosticism and paganism. That's why it's ex nihilo. Recall that the gods of the pagans were always intervening and messing about with the world of nature and human beings. And the Gnostics broadly believed that the divine principle of light was always interacting with an uncreated material principle that it was not responsible for and that was presupposed to its action, sometimes including a divine demiurge who does what he can with the matter at hand, but whose action is also limited by it. Those who think there is a conflict between science and faith, whether scientist or believer, have in effect regressed intellectually to a pagan, indeed Gnostic view of the world and God. It's as if we are in a mildly entertaining movie wielding lightsabers at one another. On the contrary, God creates and sustains from nothing natural causes and thus does not engage or interact with them as they do with each other. He is not an interacting cause, but an enabling cause. There ought not to be a conflict between faith and science. If there is such a conflict, it is only because religious believers and scientists alike do not consider well enough the nature of God, the nature of natural causes, the nature of faith, and the nature of science. The remedy for that sociological fact is the extraordinary gift that religious institutions like Notre Dame can give to the world. A setting for an education that pursues, indeed requires, greater understanding of all these things in peace. Only such an education informed by scientific knowledge and faith can teach us to hear that lovely music that moves the sun and other stars. Thank you.
Let's thank the entire panel. As I strongly suspected, our panelists had a tremendous amount to say. So because of that, let's restrict our panelists to a couple of burning questions, perhaps to one another, before we open questions up to the floor.
Restricting us to asking questions, not to make comments. Well, let me make a comment anyway while you think about it. Perhaps it's because I'm an incorrigible optimist, but the change that I reported to you in the attitude of the National Academy of Sciences seems to me a tremendous step in the direction of improving the dialogue between religion and science. In 1996, in that auditorium where we have the members of the Academy getting up and saying, if the Academy ever says anything related to religion, I will resign. Remember, the Academy is a very selected body of people. It has just about 2,000 members. In the new edition, in the 2008, that was distributed to all the members of the academies and tens of thousands otherwise. Not a single complaint, and the document is full of statements from religious authorities. The other comment I will make, which shocked me when we were preparing this final edition, we decided to use focus groups to test, that had not been done in the previous editions. And those were teachers, religious groups, public in general, all through the country. We were testing statements from the federal courts. We have the Federal District Court of Arkansas, the more recent one of Pennsylvania, and then we have the Supreme Court in '87, all coming on the side of evolution. When we tested that with all our focus groups, they don't care anything about what the court said about it. When we use statements from religious authorities, the reaction was very, very positive. People were much more interested in what religious groups, even different religions, had to say about it. Again, I see that as very positive in the dialogue between science and religion.
Dr. Callahan.
Hello? Okay. This is perhaps a question for Professor Griffiths. The point you made, maybe asking you to be more specific about the notion of Darwinian biology becoming a natural philosophy that poses a specific or a particular problem for Christian faith. I had in mind an idea of what you might mean there, and that's what you sometimes see, for instance, in the claims about sort of the war of all against all and the role of suffering and death and destruction in an evolutionarily informed philosophy of nature. And that seems, and I guess what I'm asking is if that's what you had in mind, only in the sense that if that's what you had in mind, I was thinking for a Christian or for Christian faith, that's not anything new. And one might wonder if, in fact, that's a kind of new contribution of Darwinian biology as natural philosophy, since it might be thought that the effort to understand suffering in creation is, in some respects, at the heart of Christian faith. That is, it's sort of driving Christian faith and perhaps an impetus for greater understanding and so on. So I was wondering if, one, you had that in mind, or two, you had, if not, what you had in mind.
Well, I was actually thinking in very general terms. I mean, in that's the kind that what you're sketching is fairly close to. I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, I have always been completely mystified by people who, as a result of a deep interest in population genetics, get to feel warm and fuzzy because they have a large number of grandchildren. Now, it is a complete mystery to me how being fascinated by population genetics, something I share deeply, could lead you to change your value system in a way that you put some enormous value on overrepresenting copies of your gene in future generations. I can't even understand how you can get into that mindset, but I know people who do. I take it that that's the kind of thing you're sketching. But that's only one option. I mean, when I talked about philosophy of nature, I mean, I was meaning to encompass anything from that to going back to sort of Lorenz Ocken and, you know, Naturphilosophie. I mean, the idea that you can take some bunch of material from contemporary science and try to turn it into a worldview is really all I was talking about. And all I was trying to say was that that's it's important to recognize that that's a perfectly legitimate thing for a philosopher to do. There's nothing wrong with deciding to be Lorenz Ocken or Friedrich Nietzsche and defend a philosophical worldview. The trouble is that there's always a standing temptation to try and lend that the authority that should belong to simply the technical practice of science and the results that it produces, rather than, and I think there's a lot of that going on in the contemporary debate over, say, the new atheism, for example. Perfectly defensible as if what you're trying, I mean, defensible in the sense that we can then have a good philosophical discussion about whether these arguments have any merit. But the attempt to not defend them on those grounds, but to say, if you don't believe this, you're rejecting science, is the problem.
Panelists, any more questions? Okay.
Okay. I just wanted to pick up something that John O'Callaghan, you said in passing, really, and that's the notion of wonder. Partly because I've thought about this a bit myself, but I wanted to fill out maybe from you and maybe perhaps some of the other biologists here, like Hope Holliker and Simon Conway Morris and Bernard Wood, could say how far they've experienced wonder in their own scientific work, and maybe that could begin to form a kind of bridge which could have popular appeal beyond the academy, as well as in dialogue with philosophy and theology and so on. So perhaps you could say a little bit more about the notion of wonder. Thank you.
Well, in my own case, I've forgotten more physics than I care to remember, but I do know that when I did it, I was not sort of a kind of passive, uninvolved, unpassionate observer of the pure facts. There's simply no question that even as a mediocre student, I wasn't that mediocre. I did okay in the grades area, but I mean, I never became a great scientist. That there's a sort of response to it that I hesitate to call a emotional response, but certainly a kind of sense of the awe and the wonder of the fact that this is so extraordinary. And certain features of it, certain features of mechanics even, not necessarily quantum mechanics, but just Newtonian mechanics, is just awe-inspiring. So I would just say that that's certainly been my own experience, and I'm always interested when I see great scientists suggesting it's not this kind of, abstract, mental sort of observation and so on. And then I would just finish as a philosopher saying this is the sort of thing that suggests a kind of philosophical reflection where the notion of natural philosophy, I think, does have a place. And that's going back to Aristotle when he says philosophy begins in wonder. And the cause of that wonder might be the intelligibility of the world around us. So.
Wonderful. With that, let's open questions up to the floor. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, go right ahead.
I'm not sure whether I'm considered a scientist. I mean, some of the early hominin fossils are aesthetically very wonderful, but science is a job. What really causes me to think about awe is when I hear somebody very smart give a very good lecture or a very good talk. then I wonder, you know. I mean, I'm in awe of people's minds. I'm not particularly in awe of their science.
I don't think we get paid enough for it to just be a job and us to still be scientists. I'm sorry, but I think there has to be a little bit of that awe and wonder and in doing scientific research. And for me, it's partly the idea of the genetic relatedness between everything in the world. That's pretty awe-inspiring, if you ask me. But also, just the gaining of knowledge, being able to figure out something that somebody else doesn't know yet. I think that is a prime motivating factor for a lot of scientists, the ability to gain new knowledge. So.
It's just a spit in it. I've just bought 5 seconds' time. The simple answer is yes, wonder all the time, but behind me I see the enormous shadow of G.K. Chesterton.
Right. At this point, any more responses from the panel? Okay, now questions from the floor, please.
Eric Martin, University of California, San Diego. My question is sparked by Bernard Wood's comment, but I'll open it up to anybody who'd like to respond. You said an important message is how little we know for certain in science. I'm curious where that message is located now in debates and public presentations, and who should be making that point. It strikes me that academics have very little impact on the public. So journalists, public school teachers, much more important in this respect. So as an increasing number of science and technology topics come to play an important role in our lives, I'm thinking of stem cell research, global warming, etc., how can this message be construed in a way that is still faithful to what good evidence is and what important evidence is when these issues become so politicized?
I think one of the problems is really science education, because we don't really make you know, we tend to use all the bits that we're, you know, more or less certain about. But if you're interested in the historical sciences, if you're interested in trying to reconstruct evolutionary history, then it's much more difficult. And I think we don't do a good job in science education of explaining that it's okay to say you don't know. I mean, you know, one of the things, there aren't so many professors in England as there are in this country, but when I became a professor, which is essentially a full professor here, you know, sort of somebody said, well, you know, what's it like being a professor? I said, you know, it's much easier to say I don't know.
I agree that science education is incredibly important, but at the same time, when you're talking about journalism, it doesn't necessarily make a good story. So I do think that journalists may even be trained as scientists and know that there is nuance to scientific discovery and that the whole premise is based on this sort of open debate between peer reviews. But at the same time, that's not going to make the front page of the New York Times. Now, although the New York Times is probably one of the better newspapers with respect to reporting scientific issues. But I think that's part of the problem, is that when you then put it out into the public domain for consumption in that form, it changes its character with respect to science. And it's not easy for people reading those articles to maintain in the back of their heads the main premise of science being a sort of debate discourse.
I want to take the next question.
Okay, I think this is kind of a related issue to the science education issue. And I note that Darwin's book was The Origin of Species, not The Origin of Life. And yet I see many basic textbooks in biology making a kind of an extraordinary claim that the theory of evolution can explain the origins of life. And I just wonder if there was more stress on the humility issue that was brought up by the panel, and more stress on the Miller-Urey type of experiments that show how little we know about the information issue, the formulation of proteins, the origin of amino acids, and so on. But there's remarkably little that science can tell us about the origins of life. Now, I agree with the notion of origin of species. That's a wonderful track record of various sciences have given us. But I just wonder if anybody had a comment on that.
You know, the Urey experiment and with his student is long past. There has been a considerable amount of progress on the origin of life. We now know of molecules that can do both functions, carry information, and act as enzymes, which was the sort of the chicken and egg problem that held things for a number of years, because those are the two things that you have to account for. Have we settled the problem of the origin of life? No, but a lot of progress has been made. But I could list 10,000 other questions, if given enough time and enough motivation, where we don't know the answer. I think the implication of your, perhaps the implication of your question is that we should not be able to ever to settle the question of the origin of life, and because this is something which we don't have the answer, but nevertheless taking into account all the progress that has been made and the number of questions that seem to be unsolvable in the past, and we have solved them. I frankly, for one, I don't think that is a problem that's going to escape the solution sometime when, I don't know. But to me, it does not seem a particularly different problem from so many others. For me, much more difficult problems are how to understand how the physicochemical, chemical and electrical signals with which neurons communicate, how those things become transformed in thoughts, feelings, desires, and eventually how the sense of the eye emerge. But the point I'm making is that a lot of progress has been made with respect to the understanding of how life may have come to be.
Well, I just wanted to make a follow-on comment that I know that those experiments have existed, and there is tremendous light shed on many various issues. It's the humility issue of saying that evolution really has answered the question of origins in life in our basic textbooks, I guess is my parting comment.
I frankly don't know any textbook of biology that, at least at the college level, that would say that we have solved the problem of the origins of life.
Not solved it, just implied that the answer is there.
I'm sorry?
Not solved it, just said it's implied that the answer is somewhere there in the theory of evolution.
Well, probably what they say is what I have said. They describe the experiments that are coming about. And every week and every month there are important results that are coming about. One of the persons who has contributed recently most to this field was given the Nobel Prize this year in physiology or medicine. So I think that there are reasons to believe that we are making progress. If somebody claims that we have answers where we don't have, too bad, but I really don't think that many texts, or even most, almost any text, make such a claim.
Thank you.
Anyone else on the panel, if you want to speak to the origin of life, raise your hand.
I'm going to disagree with a member of the National Academy of Sciences. I don't think the progress has been at all impressive, but that doesn't mean that we won't have an explanation, and there I think Francesco and I would agree with each other entirely. But of course the question in a textbook is, it's not much point saying we haven't got the foggiest. I think what you can do, well, you could say that, would be quite entertaining, mind you. What one can do, what even I'd argue you should do for at least high school, is invite people to consider why it's so difficult, and that's not actually as difficult a question as one might think, and also say, well, given we know what the building blocks are, how might you want to put them together in some believable environment? This will enable a high school student to get the Nobel Prize ahead of the investigators. That'll be no bad thing. And I think that the other aspect about it is that because we don't really understand what life itself is, that's perfectly all right. But there is, I don't think, no, it's not for me, it's good. then I think there too, in terms of high school teaching, one can do a great deal to explain what a very fine, balanced life actually is. So I'm sure Francesca and I agree about almost everything, but I must say that having done quite a lot of reading in this area, I stopped reading that literature some years ago because no progress was being made.
All right, at this time I'll take the final question.
Thank you. John Lyon. I'm from Providence Academy, although I was once a colleague of Dr. Sloan here. And my question is directed to any member of the panel or the entire panel. The question is very simple, but I suppose I should have a brief disclaimer in front of it. I am not now, nor ever have been, a member of the Discovery Institute, and none of my closest friends are either. The question, though, is this: why aren't William Dembski, Michael Beha, David Berlinski, or their like here to talk with us? They do research. They have doctorate degrees. When we stick them, they bleed, so on. Now, I am in no position to estimate the worth of the research done by those three men that I've mentioned, or any of the men or women on the panel here. I think I am, though, in a position to estimate the worth of the rhetoric that has been used in reference to these Discovery Institute people and sorts. The comments have been snide, dismissive, by innuendo, attempting to co-opt the audience on the side of the speaker. This seems to me to be eminently unfair. Thank you.
All of us have answers to that. First of all, you must have been in a different conference from mine, because I have not seen a proliferation of comments of that kind. With respect to why they are not here, the persons that you have mentioned, because you would have to ask the organizers. But none of those persons, talking as a scientist, to the extent to those who claim to be scientists, there is only one who has published in professional biological journals, but none of them has published in a professional journal dealing with evolution issues. That is, they will not be considered by the academic community professional scientists on the subject of evolution. They may be very smart and write other things. So to the extent that we are discussing evolution, at least for the science, you bring scientists who are publishing in professional journals.
I would hate to apply that principle to all members of the panel up here.
So can I just understand, were you suggesting that that we have been that our behavior towards them has been reproachful?
Yes, my first question was, why aren't they here? Or
Well,
someone like them.
Let me just explain. I mean, I was at a meeting with Michael Behe, and I'm against animal cruelty, and it was like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, it was embarrassing. I mean, it was frankly embarrassing. And I wasn't doing the shooting, but I was, around while the shots were fired. And it was just frankly embarrassing, And these were people, one of the speakers was the president of the Royal Society. These were people who were eminent scientists, and it was frankly embarrassing. And I've debated against somebody from the Discovery Institute at the Honors School at George Washington University, and they sent along a lawyer. This guy wasn't a scientist. He had some really fancy PowerPoint slides, a lot more fancy than me. But, once he was off the script, students could see that there was nothing there. And I'm not sure that maybe that's what we should do. We should ask them along, but it was really, it was really animal cruelty.
Well,
And I'm not exaggerating. It was really bad.
Well, if they bleed when they're stuck, then let them bleed.
Yeah, but I'm not, it was embarrassing. I felt for the guy.
I'm going to take Dr. O'Callahan next.
Just as a matter of fact, both Bill Dembski and Michael Behe have spoken at Notre Dame in this kind of forum. As to why they're not in this particular discussion, I had nothing to do with that. I think, and I've actually have engaged Michael Behe in a conversation in a particularly straightforward manner at a conference and so on. And so if I have a difficulty with what, say, Michael Behe or Bill Dembski put forward, I'll let the philosophers of science and science address the question of intelligent design or whatever as science. But when I engaged Michael Behe, the question I asked him was a straightforward one, and that is, if you're going to put it forward as science, which is what he was doing, presumably you have to give an account of, even if it's true, what would count as evidence that it's false. And I know we're not supposed to think falsification is now just sufficient for being science, but it's still got some sort of role to play. And again, you can talk to the philosophers of science about that. But his answer to me was, well, if there's a naturalistic explanation of the phenomenon, then you don't say that God did it. And I just asked him, I said, well, don't you see as a Christian, that is, and so now I was moving into the sort of believing Orthodox Christian mode, and that is, that view of our understanding of God, doesn't that lead you into a kind of, well, you might think heterodox position on divine providence, because it would seem to suggest that if you're going to treat intelligent design as science, then it has to be science in such a way that it would exclude God from those things that science actually explains. And he didn't have an answer for that. And so in that sense, I don't have any difficulty talking with Michael Behe or Bill Dembski, but I do think it's legitimate to sort of raise questions about the extent to which they put it forward as science and have really thought about the issues both from the perspective of philosophy of science, but also from the perspective of Christian belief, what's involved in putting forward something as science, which I think isn't science.
Phil, are you going to speak?
Yes, I probably should say a word as being one of the organizers and a former colleague of John Lyon, just to answer that. I think one of the things about organizing this symposium is we didn't want to replay a lot of old records, and one of those old records is continuously reworking a debate that's going on that we know there's been all sorts of things written on this. We have a very good discussion on the Riley website, on the Riley reports on intelligent design. I think it's a very fair and balanced one. But I think in our case, when we were saying Darwin in the 21st century, and let's look not simply retrospectively at a lot of old debates, but let's look forward and see what kind of creative dialogue we can create. So I think that is the fundamental reason why we don't have a lot of other opposing views represented here. Thanks.
I have the feeling in this discussion we should distinguish between some criticisms that people of intelligent design do toward certain scientific explanations. And they must say they're in general very clever. We should take their criticism sometimes more seriously. But the kind of explanations they provide, that is supernatural explanations in natural science, this is ridiculous. This is something that is simply, they are the dilettantes from the philosophical and the theological point of view. There are some scientists that one day they awake and thought that it's possible to deal with these issues like one is with toys. It is something that is simply groundless. So if discussion is about the position of intelligent design, probably the best thing here is what the person, the anthropologist said, that is, this was embarrassing. I personally am embarrassed for them, so.
Okay, well, we are well over time, so we need to thank our panel once again, please. So I want to remind you that the next event will be at 8 o'clock.